So again, everything depends on everything else. There is no one fixed, permanent something, element from which everything derives or which everything arises. So again, nothing is permanent. Everything's always changing. That also means nothing is random, which I think is really interesting, because sometimes we can feel like, man, stuff's being randomly visited upon me, right? There is nothing that's actually random. So we might not understand causes and conditions, but causes and conditions are there. They might be widely separated across space and time, but somehow causes and conditions are there. So things don't happen because a force sort of outside of nature is making them happen on a whim. When I was in grad school, I had a professor who, when he was talking about Buddhist-related stuff, did not use the word supernatural. He said, because what that means is like outside of nature. Well, there is nothing outside of the Buddha way. So he might say something appears fantastic, right? If it was something we couldn't explain, right? But there is nothing outside of nature. There is nothing outside of the Buddha way. So reality or the universe works the way it works. There's a reason for things, even if we don't know what that is. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about causes and conditions. So cause is like a seed. There's a potential for something to arise. Condition is like the soil. So certain elements have to be in place for that arising to happen. So you can plant a seed on a rock, right? It's not going to grow because the conditions aren't right. And you can have a patch of lovely, wonderful soil, but without a seed, you've got conditions but no cause. And again, nothing's going to grow. So something has to happen. There has to be some interconnectedness between causes and conditions for any particular thing to happen, or for anything to happen in a particular way, right? So there's a direct, important relationship here to Four Noble Truths. One of the reasons cause and effect is so important for us is that this is one of the things like Buddha realized when he sat into the three. Oh, wait a minute. Suffering has a cause, and we can identify what the cause is, right? There's a cause and condition for suffering, which means we can do something about that. So desire and suffering create one another. There's an interesting relationship here, right? So they're causes and conditions for each other, or we could say they're mutually dependent, right? So desire gives rise to suffering, and suffering gives rise to desire. So I want something, so I'm suffering because of that. I want to break my suffering, or I want to get that thing in order to release myself from suffering, right? And we have this thing. This is why we go around and around and around in samsara. So desire and suffering, mutually dependent, if you will. So the Eightfold Path then breaks that cycle. We do some practice, we cultivate some wisdom and compassion, we break that cycle. So, important thing that Buddha discovered, suffering has a cause. It's dependent on something, in this case desire. It's not random, it's not entirely unpredictable. It's sometimes unpredictable. We don't always know exactly where our suffering is coming from, right? But we have agency when it comes to desire, when it comes to suffering. That's our practice. There's something we can actually do. And for me, that's what makes this practice hopeful and encouraging. So when we look at something like the First Noble Truth, life is characterized by suffering, we go, man, what a pessimistic worldview. Or try to explain to your family and friends, what's this Buddhism thing about? Well, Buddha says life is characterized by suffering. And they go, I don't want any part of that, Or the other reaction you get is, well, I'm not suffering, I'm just fine. Well, okay. If we accept that life is characterized by suffering, then the rest of those Four Noble Truths is encouraging. There's something we can do about that. There are causes and conditions. Things are arising because of other things, right? So it's not something over which we have no control. Sometimes, maybe this happened to you. Sometimes as a child, I remember saying to my parents if I was upset by something, and they were saying, well, calm down, behave. But I can't help how I feel. I'm angry, I'm sad. I can't help as a child how I feel. And at the time, your whole world is this feeling of suffering and unhappiness, right? And when you get a little older, or maybe you start to practice, oh, I can take some responsibility for how I feel. If I see the world with wisdom and compassion, something happens, and I am not out of control with my suffering and emotions and anger and sadness and whatever. Okay, so change your understanding of reality, see reality clearly, something happens as a result of that, causes and conditions. So there's a verse about dependent arising. I think I put it in your handout. When this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. When this ceases, that ceases. It sounds like a no-brainer. And yet, do we really live with an understanding that there are causes and conditions in this way. So dependent arising is often pictured as a 12-fold chain or a wheel of life, and that's what's on the back of your handout. So I recognize that the color version of that image is so complicated you can't see it well. That's why there's a line art next to it. I encourage you to go online, find a good copy of that color wheel, and blow it way up so you can see what's going on. Because as an image, this is an important image for us, right? So it's there as on your handout kind of as a reference point, but I know you can't see it well, and that's why I also include the line out there. So what's going on in this wheel? One condition leads to the arising of the next, and this is how we go around and around and around in this wheel of samsara. So I want to take each one very quickly. Again, we're not going to have time to go into depth because there's 12 of these things, but let's talk about them briefly, and you can follow along in your wheel. So the first one is ignorance or blindness. So not knowing the truth, not understanding the Dharma, not knowing about the Four Noble Truths. We don't know what's going on, right? In the middle, in the very, very middle of that wheel, you see that there are the three poisons, right? Greed, anger, and ignorance, represented by three different animals, and you notice that each one has got the tail of the one in front of it in its mouth, and they're in a circle. What are they doing? Each one is kind of giving rise to the next. They all arise together. Greed, anger, and ignorance kind of arises together, but ignorance is the basis of all of it. So we have greed because we're ignorant. We have anger because we're ignorant. We don't see how the world works. So ignorance is like the basis of it all. So volitional formations, fabrications, constructions. These things have a lot of names, but this is the second one. Because we don't understand the truth, we are involved with all kinds of actions of body, speech, and mind, because this is where we create karma, right? The three places we create karma: body, speech, and mind. And this is where it all starts. So because we don't understand, we do things with this body, speech, and mind, which may or may not be helpful. The third one is consciousness or discernment, sense consciousness. Life force. I've seen this translated as life force, and I put that one in here because Uchiyama Roshi is constantly talking about life force. Not within the context of the 12-fold chain, but I think that's an interesting relationship that I just encourage people to dig into. So what's going on there? We've done something with this body, speech, and mind, and now the energy of that activity, the force of that karma, results in some sense of self-awareness. So this is, again, we talked about the five skandhas: form, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness. Things happen, and then suddenly five skandhas are clinging to five skandhas. They have a sense that somehow they are permanent. They are a fixed self, right? We have this ongoing sense of self-awareness. So that's the third one. Fourth one, name and form. You might know this as namarupa. Toda-san frequently talks about namarupa. You might know this as that. Body and mind, or sometimes conception, right? So with self-awareness comes the developments of bodies and mind, the sense that we have some physical form that's moving through the world. Next one is our six senses. So once we have bodies and minds, of course, we have physical senses: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind. So these are the gateways, if you will, that we use to take in information about the world. Then we have contact, sometimes called sense impression or perception. Somehow these six sense gates come into contact with things of the world, and something happens, right? So we're not sort of floating around in the air. We have some contact with something. Senses have some contact with something. Each sense gate, each sense organ has contact with the thing that's appropriate for it. So eye and sight, ear and sound, smell and tongue and taste, right? Each thing has contact, each sense has contact with the thing that's appropriate for it. Yeah, and we're sort of aware that that contact is happening. So what you're starting to see is these things will happen in our awareness that fast. We're starting to break this down. Like if this was going really slowly, what would we see happening, right? But we just have contact and something happens, right? So next one is feeling or sensation. So this is where, again, we decide something is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral for me. It's happening constantly. Even when we're not aware, we don't have intention about it. We are constantly saying, I'm happy, I'm unhappy, I'm comfortable, I'm uncomfortable, this is good, this is bad, constantly, like moment by moment by moment. Then we immediately go to craving, desire, greed, right? We call this thirsting desire in one of the weeks that we met, right? Tanha, thirsting desire. So now we act on that decision about feeling. Oh, I feel good about this thing, I want it. I don't feel good about this thing, I want to run away from it, right? This is where we make the choice about what comes next, right? So this includes, so craving, desire, thirst. We go to clinging, grasping, attachment, right? Now we're acting on desire, chasing, running away, latching onto things. This includes our ideas about self, our personal views. We want more and more pleasures of the senses. We even get attached to things like our bodhisattva vows. Oh my gosh, am I not a wonderful practitioner because I took vows, or I'm upholding vows, or I'm practicing in a certain way? We can get attached to a lot of things. We can get attached to our anger. We can get attached to unwholesomeness. We can get attached to a lot of things, right? So that's a big piece we get to look at or work on. Next one is existence or becoming. So we set up these habits of suffering. They keep us going around and around and around the wheel of samsara. It's hard to let go of those unwholesome habits. They just keep coming around, right? It keeps coming back. I eat too much cake today, I'm probably going to eat too much cake again tomorrow. Something keeps coming up. Then finally we end up with the last two, birth or rebirth. So traditionally, this was actual rebirth. So I think next week or the week after we talk about actual rebirth. That's North Americans have lots of feelings about that, right? But we can think about birth or rebirth. We might want to simply consider how we're creating ourselves and creating our world moment by moment by moment, because of course we are. We have agency around that. So how am I recreating moment by moment my sense of self, the world as I perceive it, the way I think things are supposed to be? Am I basing that on the three poisons? Am I basing that on wisdom and compassion? What am I putting in the world moment by moment by moment? And finally, we have aging or decay and death. So as soon as there's birth or arising in this human form, of course, we know there's illness, there's aging, there's death. We know that from Buddha's own experience. And then we start all over again, right? Ignorance. So teachings about this 12-fold chain can very quickly become technical and complicated. And on top of that, interpretations or understanding of 12-fold chain has shifted a lot across space and time. So if you look at the very early teachings, they'll talk about 12-fold chain in a particular way. And as you move through space and time and you go through the Mahayana and into the Vajrayana, the interpretation shifts. So there are multiple interpretations of this. And I just want to say again, feel free to read about this, study about this on your own. But again, understand the source of what you're looking at, because you might see two different things that sound very different. And they're both, it's not that one of them is wrong. But no, am I looking at something from early Pali tradition? Am I looking at something from Vajrayana? Because there are multiple interpretations. So again, the important thing for today is this understanding that the arising of everything depends on causes and conditions. One thing leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing. So what we call those, how many steps there are, how many pieces there are in the wheel, for today is less important than just that understanding, right? The wheel is turning, things are arising, things are perishing. It's not random. So if we cultivate good conditions, we get a chance to deal with our suffering, right? If we cultivate wholesomeness and steadiness and the Eightfold Path and all those things, then it leads to our opportunity to deal with our suffering. If we cultivate bad conditions, we simply increase our suffering, or we don't get rid of the suffering that we have. So, right, things lead to things. And again, I take from this, the good news is we have agency. We can understand and take control of the way our lives are going, the way our suffering is arising. And the bad news is we have agency. The bad news is no one's going to save us. No one's going to practice for us, right? We have to do it. This thing is a practice that we have to do. So nobody's going to sort of land from another planet and do this thing for us. So the good news is we can do something. And the maybe less good news is this is where that something needs to happen, right? We need to do that for ourselves. Okay.